Everybody is talking about the West Virginia offense for 2026, but I'm predicting that WVU finishes the season with a top 50 defense. Now, to do that, they have to close a massive gap. So today, we're looking at five numbers that will make or break this season. Fellow Mountaineers, you made it to another edition of the Trust the Beard podcast. I'm your host, The Beard. And again, today we are going to break down the West Virginia defense for 2026. And without further ado, let's get right into it. If West Virginia is going to take a major step forward defensively in 2026, we need to talk about the numbers because the numbers tell us exactly where this defense has struggled, where it actually performed well, and most importantly, what needs to change if WVU is going to become a legitimate top 50 defense. And that's what we're looking at today. So I've put together five important defensive categories and compared WVU's numbers to the average of the teams that finished in the top 50 nationally from 2021 to 2025. So it's nearly 100 teams I looked at here. These are pretty eye-popping numbers, and it's no surprise that we are significantly behind the top 50 average in a couple major categories, but there's also areas where this defense is already right there. So let's break this down. So we're looking at yards per game allowed. All right, the average for the top 50 defense, between the years of 2021 and 2025, it was about 323.5 yards per game. West Virginia was 435 last season. That's a difference of almost 112 yards, and that's massive. So we're talking about an enormous gap between where WVU was and where it needs to be. And as you can see, the graphic shows that we were ranked 118th nationally. That was out of, I think, 136 teams. So if we're asking what's the biggest fix for WVU, this is probably the easiest answer, right? The defense has to get off the field, right? When you're giving up that many yards, you're putting an enormous amount of pressure on your offense. And you're asking your offense to consistently score 30 plus points just to keep you in games. And, that might work with Rodriguez in a few games, but it's not really sustainable. So here's the important part. I'm not saying that we suddenly have to get all the way down to 323.5 yards. That's, again, a huge jump. But if you can just cut that to maybe 50, 60 yards, now you're talking about a dramatic difference. And so if WVU can get closer to that top 50 range, we're talking about a defense that can actually change, the outcome of football games. So now we're going to focus on yards per play, right? This might be the next most important number. The average was 4.82 for those teams in the top 50. West Virginia was 5.7, ranked 89th nationally. Now, defense doesn't necessarily need to give up huge plays every possession to have a bad yards per play number, but it typically happens because you're consistently giving up 5, 6, 7 plays or yards at a time. And that's how drives stay alive. So when you look at the first two numbers together, they tell a pretty compelling story. 435 yards a game, 5.7 per play. That tells me this defense needs to become much more efficient on a play-to-play basis. And sometimes the biggest defensive improvement is simply turning what might be a 6, 7 yard gain into a 3 yard gain, or turning a first down into a second and long, right? And getting off the field. That's how you start lowering these stats. And eventually that's how you get to lower yards per game. So now we'll look at third down conversions. Really important category, right? The graphic lists WVU at 6.1, and the average was 4.61. 111th nationally, it's absolutely terrible because third down is where your defenses have to finish. But if you consistently allow offenses to convert third downs, eventually those drives are going to end in points, even if you have, solid play on first and second down. So longer third downs, right, create more opportunities for sacks and completions. This is another area where West Virginia has to find a lot of room to improve. Now we're going to look at red zone touchdown percentage. So if you follow me for any point of time, when I count red zone scores, it's touchdowns and not field goal. Anyone can score from 40 yards out. It's much harder to punch it in for a touchdown. So you look here, we were ranked 67. We were at 0.58 listed against the average at 0.509. So while we're not in the top 50 average, it's much closer to some of the other categories. And that tells me something, right? This defense has shown an ability to tighten up when the field gets shorter. But there's also another number to go along with this that kind of skews the data a bit. So the graphic points out that while we are 62nd in red zone scoring, we actually allowed 53 red zone attempts last year. That ranked 118th nationally. So while we were only allowing maybe 60% of those to be touchdowns, we let opponents into the red zone like we parted the Red Sea. So that is a number that's going to have to drastically be reduced as well, right? If you're allowing opponents to get in there frequently, even if you're not giving up touchdowns, eventually that's going to take its toll. So WVU needs to do two things here. Number one, keep offenses out of the red zone. Duh, right? Number two, continue to improving on the stat of once opponents get inside the 20. If you can do both, that's where you start to dramatically improve your scoring defense. So now we're going to look at turnovers. And this is one of my favorite stats because it is a great equalizer, right? It can turn a bad game into a really good one very quickly. So the top 50 average for forced turnovers per game was 1.7. West Virginia was 1.6 in 2025. Incredibly close. And that puts us at 31st nationally in this category. That's a huge deal because this is the first number on the graphic where you actually see the number and say, hey, West Virginia's got something going on here, right? They're already operating at a top 50 level. And what's even more important, if you look at the graphic below that, West Virginia forced 1.9 fumbles per game, which was third nationally, third in the country at forcing the opponent to put the ball on the ground. Now, the fact that we didn't have more turnovers per game means we weren't jumping on the ball, which Zac Alley has made note of. And this is something to build on, right? Because creating turnovers, again, is one of the fastest ways to change the outcome of a football game. So we're going to put all five of these categories together. And what does West Virginia actually need to do? Well, I think there's three major objectives. One, we got to reduce explosive and consistent yardage. Two, we got to get off the field on third down. And number three, keep creating turnovers. Well, how do we do that? Well, you need an increase in talent, right? That's the quickest way. So right now we'll look at how the players will help shape this 2026 defense. There is a pretty significant difference between saying a recruiting class is better and actually being able to show the improvement. When you look at West Virginia's 2025 recruiting numbers compared to what the Mountaineers put together for 2026, there's one number that immediately jumps off the screen: 14.2%. West Virginia's recruiting score has improved by 14.2% for 2026, according to the ratings from 24/7 Sports and On3. And what's really interesting is that this improvement isn't coming from just one position group. We're seeing a major improvement across, all the defense. So today we're going to break down exactly what changed and where WVU improved the most. So let's start with the big picture. On the left side of the graphic, we got 24/7 Sports recruiting ranking. On the right, we got On three. And we're looking at D line, edge, linebacker, cornerback, safety. And we're comparing these numbers. And the first thing that stands out is the overall average. So, regardless of which recruiting service you prefer, the overall message is pretty clear. The talent level is moving upward. And that's really what makes the 14.2% number so interesting, because this isn't simply adding a couple of highly rated players, right? There is improvement spread throughout the defensive recruiting profile. And that's exactly what you see when you're trying to build a defense. So let's bring everything back to the headline: 14.2% improvement. What does that actually mean? Well, it means that the recruiting profile for this season is not simply a continuation of 2025. There are areas where WVU is maintaining its strength and other areas where they're making substantial gains. We know about the $5 million they held over from last year to implement into this year, and obviously the new record breaking numbers that we're getting in donations. But you put all these numbers together, and the overall picture is a much stronger recruiting profile. And that's the part that matters, because recruiting rankings doesn't automatically equal wins, right? A 5-star recruit doesn't automatically become an All American. A highly rated class doesn't automatically become a great defense. But recruiting gives you the raw material that you need to build a great defense. And if you're consistently bringing in better athletes, better depth, more competition, and more players capable of playing at that level, then your chances of building a better football team go up drastically. So when you look at all this, here's my big takeaway: The 2026 recruiting profile is much better. The average numbers are higher. The transfer numbers show West Virginia continuing to use the portal as part of a roster building strategy. There's still questions, right? There's still positions that need to develop. And obviously, recruiting rankings don't tell us the results of Saturday. But this is the part that I think is encouraging. West Virginia's recruiting score improved 14.2%. Now, the next question is the only one that really matters. Can that improvement in recruiting translate into improvement on the field? Because if it does, then West Virginia could be looking at a very different defense by the time we get to the end of the 2026 season. So let's take that 14.2% and see how it applies to the statistics. So, what if West Virginia's improvement in recruiting actually showed up on the football field? All right, that's a question I wanted to answer. We know that our recruiting score improved 14.2%, right, based on 24/7 sports and on three. But obviously, recruiting rankings and on field performance are two completely different things. A 4.2 improvement in recruiting does not automatically mean a 14.2 improvement in defensive statistics. What if the talent that we brought in for 2026 translated into a 14.2% improvement in our statistical performance? What would that look like? So, in this segment, we're going to walk through exactly how I got there, what a 14.2% improvement actually means, and historically, how those numbers translate to the national level. So, again, we have the yards per game, yards per play, third down, red zone, turnovers. And as you can see, the numbers are substantially better with the 14% change and the rankings that follow. And that's the number I want to get everyone paying attention to is the average of the adjusted ranking, 32.6. Because under this hypothetical scenario, right, these five categories, we would be close to a top 30 defense. Now, again, this is not a prediction, right? It's not what the graphic is saying. What it is saying is if we took the numbers from 2025, applied that 14.2% change because of the influx in talent, these are the numbers that we would get nationally across the board. And that's a completely different way of looking at this defense. Instead of asking, can we become a top 50 defense? We're asking, what would the numbers look like for us to become a top 50 defense? And I think the bigger question is, can Zac Alley, in his second year, a defensive coordinator, improve our defense by 14.2%? Does he have it in him? Well, that's what we're going to look at right now. So we've talked about the recruiting side. We've talked about what 14.2% improvement in recruiting means on the football field, potentially. But now we get to what I think is the most important question of the video. Has Zac Alley actually shown that he can improve a defense? Because it's one thing to look at the recruiting rankings and say, well, WVU has better talent, but it's another thing to look at the coordinator's history and ask, when Zac Alley takes over a defense, does that defense actually get better? And that's what I want to look at. So we're going to look at three different stops in Alley's career as defensive coordinator: UL Monroe, Jacksonville State, and Oklahoma. So at ULM, the overall improvement measurement shows 12%. At Jacksonville State, it's 11, and Oklahoma, it's 1255. And you notice these are the same categories I used to compare with WVU, and they're 14.2%. So when you look at that, the improvement he had at each one of these schools, you compare that to the 14.2 that we're projecting with WVU and what they could do, suddenly that number doesn't seem quite as unrealistic. So let's start with ULM, right? He took over as DC, and they were coming off a very, very bad season. In 2020, they went 0-10, and statistically, it was just an awful defense. And then Alley's first season is 2021, and you immediately start seeing improvement, right? And it wasn't some massive statistical improvement in every single category, but if you look, the yards per play went down from 6.7 to 6.3. That's 6% improvement. Third down defense improved 10%. And then there was a 30% increase in turnovers. But here's what makes this ULM example interesting. The defense didn't suddenly become elite, right? This wasn't a case where Alley walked in and suddenly the Warhawks were like the Georgia Bulldogs, right? The entire program moved forward after going 0-10 in 2020, right? They end up going 4-10 the next season. And I know that's not a championship season, But when you haven't won any and then the next year you win 4, that's a huge step forward. And so Alley took over a struggling defense, made measurable improvements. But then we're going to look at Jacksonville State and see where these numbers really get interesting. So in 2022, Jacksonville State was playing at the FCS level, right? So they bumped up to the Conference USA in 2023, and this is all under head coach Rich Rodriguez. So this simply wasn't year one versus year two, right? With the exact same level of competition. The schedule got significantly harder. Despite that, the number of wins stayed the same, right? They went 9-2 the first year, 9-4 the second year. So the wins actually stayed at 9, but now they were coming against an FBS schedule. And that's really an important piece of context because if you're only looking at the record, you might say, well, 9-2 versus 9-4, what's the improvement? But that's missing the bigger picture. So we'll look at the defense. In the first year, they allowed 389.7 yards per game. And that was reduced to 352.8, a 9.47 reduction. That's significant. Then yards per play went down from 5.4 to 4.8, 11%. That's huge. And then the third down conversions went down 13%. So we're seeing the same pattern again. The defense is becoming more efficient. They're giving up fewer yards. They're getting off the field more effectively. And then you look at the turnovers was a 5% decrease, which that's okay because in year one you're forcing 2 per game. That's elite. So dropping down to 1.9 isn't that significant. But your red zone scoring actually went from 54.3 to 56. Right, that's about a 3.1% decline. But the more important stat out of this is that from year 1 to year 2, the red zone attempts by the opponent dropped by 30%. That is huge. So while your percentage of touchdowns went up a little bit, the amount of times you allowed the opponents to get in the red zone dropped off dramatically. So when we put all that together, right, Jacksonville State's 11% increase in their statistics. And again, they still won 9 games. That's jumping from FCS to Conference USA. That's a massive difference. But then we get to Oklahoma. And I think this is where I think the argument becomes much stronger. Right, I think Oklahoma gives us the cleanest example because now we're talking about a Power 4 program with much larger resources, much more recognizable level of competition. One thing to point out here with Oklahoma and the Sooners, their record actually got worse. So in 2023, and this was before Brent Venables and Zac Alley, they went 10-3. They were still in the Big 12. Then they jumped to the SEC, went 6-7. And that's, mainly because of the upgrade in competition, right, from the Big 12 to the SEC, but also a coaching change, right? This is Brent Venables' first year on the job. So if you're looking at wins and losses, you could say, well, the defense didn't really get better because the team got worse. But actually, the record doesn't tell you what happened to the defense. So in 2024, the defense was statistically better than their 2023, despite the team having a worse record overall. Right, the team record and defensive performance aren't always the same thing. A program can win the same number of games while facing significantly better competition. So what does this mean for West Virginia? Let's bring it back to WVU because really that's what the entire point of this is. We've established that West Virginia's recruiting profile improved 14.2%. But again, recruiting rankings don't win games. Players have to develop, the scheme has to work, and the defensive coordinator has to put those players in a position to succeed. So can Zac Alley take that improved talent and turn it into improved defense? Well, we've got 3 great examples. So ULM, almost 12% overall improvement. Jacksonville State, 11. Oklahoma, 12.55. And now at WVU, while we set the target at 14.2, he doesn't necessarily have to reach that, as you saw with the previous 3 schools. But that's not a completely ridiculous number. It's actually in the general range of the improvement we've seen from Alley before. And that's what makes this prediction interesting, right? We're not saying Zac Alley has improved every defense by 14.2. We're saying his previous stops show a pattern of meaningful defensive improvement. And now he's entering year 2 at West Virginia. The players understand the terminology, at least the ones that stuck around. There was like 30 some. But all the new guys have been here since spring, right? We didn't have to re-recruit because of second portal window. And now the coaches better understand what they have because they've had a full year to evaluate and recruit this talent. So instead of spending the entire offseason figuring out who people are, what went wrong, you can start building around what you know works. That's exactly what this prediction is doing. If Zac Alley has previously produced overall defensive improvement at ULM, Jacksonville State, and Oklahoma, can he get that same improvement at West Virginia? Can he get to 14.2? I mean, if he can't, I think that's okay, but can he at least meet the average of these three teams, about 11.85%? If so, there's no question in my mind that West Virginia will be an elite top 50 defense for 2026. Well, guys, that's my episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like, share, subscribe, follow me on all my socials, and always remember to trust the beard. Goodbye. God bless. Go Ears.